Crimea is not a disputed territory. Russia has long recognized the borders of today's Ukraine. I believe that raising such issues regarding Russia has a provocative undertone. The problem of Crimean Tatars, the Ukrainian population, the Russian population, and the Slavic population in general is an internal political issue of Ukraine itself.
It seems Turkey is not happy with Putin going back on his words. Turkey has been saying it from the beginning that Crimea belongs to Ukrainians and Ukraine belongs to Ukrainians. And now Turkey is ready to put its money where its mouth is. Or I guess more specifically, Turkey is ready to put its troops to back up its words. Just a week ago, Zelensky went to Turkey to have a meeting with President Erdogan, and now Turkey is announcing a week after that meeting that it's ready to send troops to Ukraine. First, here are some details from that meeting.
Thank you so much.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky used a visit to Turkey on Tuesday to emphasize the importance of Ukraine's allies deploying soldiers to guarantee any peace agreement reached with Russia.
Two issues are very important: a strong Ukrainian army and the deployment in Ukraine from other armies like Europe and the United States, our partners.
Zelensky said he had discussed the issue with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, but that it was too early to reveal the outcome of the talks.
Turkey and European countries have the same geostrategic interest. If you ask to Turkey and Turkish policymakers, for them, the main threat to security and stability of the country and integrity of the country remain Russia.
European leaders met this week to discuss the security threat facing the continent. With the Turkish army dwarfing most of its European counterparts, Ankara says it can play a key role in Europe's defense.
European allies can be understood that without Turkey we cannot continue the defense of the European continent and Euro-Atlantic security. And Turkey is ready to support this European security and defense capability.
And then yesterday we had this report from Bloomberg. NATO member Turkey open to deploying peacekeepers in Ukraine. President Erdogan has discussed the matter with Zelensky and Lavrov. Trump has said he would support European allies as peacekeeper. Before we jump into the details of this article, it's important to point out that Turkey has the second largest military in NATO, so it's definitely a big military powerhouse. Now, there's an important point here, a condition that Turkey has before it provides the troops. And here's that condition. Turkey would not be part of any peacekeeping missions unless it is involved in all consultations and preparations regarding its formation. Both France and the UK have said they are willing to deploy troops to Ukraine as part of a package of security guarantees aimed at ensuring any peace settlement holds, on condition the US provides a backstop and supports the initiative. Now, Turkey's demands are not that unreasonable. It's not like a get out of free jail card where they're just saying things which they will not fulfill because of unreasonable demands. All they're asking for is they be part of the negotiations and they're willing to provide troops to make sure Russia doesn't come back knocking.
Turkey's Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan stressed on Thursday that his country cannot be excluded from possible future European defense structures.
If the European security architecture is to be restructured, it is of course impossible for this to happen without Turkey. In other words, leaving Turkey out. A security architecture approach that excludes a military power like Turkey will not be very realistic. This is another point that certainly needs to be emphasized.
Now, on top of this, Turkey has been a big supporter of Ukraine ever since the war started. Of course, first thing we cannot fail to mention is the fact that the first two negotiations that took place in 2022 did take place in Turkey, in Ankara specifically. And on top of that, the grain deal that was negotiated in 2022 was negotiated because of Turkey. They acted as a mediator between both Russia and Ukraine. While doing all this, Turkey has been also helping Ukraine militarily. Turkey has one of the best defense industry in Europe and one of the most sought-after drone programs in the world. And those drones that Turkey manufactures, TB2, became one of the most important weapons in Ukraine's arsenal at the start of the war. In fact, it was so effective that Ukrainian soldiers had a song to signify the importance of the drone that Turkey was providing. Let's listen to that.
So as we've been reporting, drones are playing a key role in Ukraine's counteroffensive against Russia's invasion. One is proving so effective that Ukrainian forces are singing its praises, literally. CNN's Giovanna Karatse has this exclusive report.
This Ukrainian song has gone viral in Ukraine and beyond. It's an ode to a drone. The Bayraktar, the Turkish-made weapon Ukrainian officials are touting as one of the most effective in their arsenal that's played a part in slowing down the Russian advance. The Bayraktar TB2 has been operational for years, described as a game changer in recent conflicts like Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh, but it is Ukraine that has catapulted it to worldwide fame. Its success not only on the battlefield. Videos of strikes against Russian military targets like this one released by Ukraine's Ministry of Defense on social media have also made it a key part of Ukraine's information war.
Now, of course, Russia is not happy with this news. Turkey publicly saying that what Russia is doing is illegal. It needs to give Ukraine back all its land, including Crimea. And on top of that, it's just not been a good week for Russia. First, Trump signs a deal with Ukraine saying that US would protect its business interest in Ukraine. Then Trump says that US will provide Ukraine with as many weapons as Ukraine needs to defend themselves against the Russian aggression. Then we had the UK Prime Minister say that they will provide troops for Ukraine's safety. Then we had the French president say that Russia is the one who should be paying for damages in this war. Russia should be paying Ukraine, Russia should be paying the US, and Russia should be paying Europe and UK. Russia should be paying for this because it was Russia who started this war. So Russia did have to come out and say something. So what is Russia saying? They're saying that, hey, negotiations, the territories are not on the negotiating table. If NATO countries send their troops, negotiations will be called off. Listen to it yourself.
We cannot consider any alternatives. By the way, I don't know what Macron said. He didn't play his role very convincingly in Washington. But President Trump, when this topic was brought up at the press conference, as I read, said that the decision on deploying peacekeeping forces is only possible with consent. Some people say, well, okay, there were ideas. Let's establish a line of contact. This part is Russian and this part is Ukrainian. First of all, that won't happen. We have a constitution based on the will of the people. And secondly, what remains of Ukraine should also be freed from Russian laws. There are still people there who find it more convenient to speak Russian and who want to preserve the traditions of their ancestors.
Here we have Lavrov saying that he has orders from Putin that there would be no peace if there are European troops allowed in Ukraine, under any flag. No NATO troops, no EU troops, no European national troops. That's just something Russia won't go for. And I'm pointing it out specifically that Lavrov says that Putin has ordered this himself, while Trump is saying that Putin is telling him something entirely different. Listen to it yourself.
Convince Vladimir Putin to accept the European troops as peacekeeper, will you think?
Yeah, he will accept that.
He will accept
I've
it?
asked him that question.
You talked to me?
I've asked him that question.
He said yes?
Because he's not, look, if we do this deal, he's not looking for war, he doesn't mind, but I've specifically asked him that question. He has no problem with it.
Now, after this, Trump, I'm guessing, decided to do a little bit of trolling because he just came out and said that we're gonna try to take back as much territory as possible for Ukraine. Maybe US will also liberate Mariupol just to, help Ukraine out and push Russia out of Ukrainian territory. I'm sure the Russian officials are having a great night. Here's Trump's comments.
Mr. President, are there areas specifically of Ukraine that you're talking about in giving back, specifically Crimea? Have you gotten to those details yet on such an agreement?
Well, you mean the areas that were taken?
Yeah.
There are a lot of areas that were taken. Yeah, we've talked about it. A lot of the sea line has been taken. And we'll be talking about that, and we're going to see if we can get it back, or get a lot of it back for Ukraine, if that's possible. We'll be seeing about that, okay? Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much.
I personally think US should help Ukraine liberate all those territories because if we really think about it just from the point of view Trump wants to think about it, that's the minerals deal. A lot of Ukrainian minerals are under territories that Russia controls. And now that Zelensky is in the United States, he's signing the minerals deal today. We do have a vested interest in all the minerals that Ukraine has, and that includes the minerals under the territory that Russia controls. So, if the US can help Ukraine get those territories back, we have a direct economical benefit for the country, for the American businesses by doing so. Now, there was one comment Trump made a few weeks ago that was a bit unsettling, and that was the fact that he said he trusts Putin. And he believes Putin when Putin says that he wants peace in Ukraine. That's just not true. As you guys saw at the start of the video, Putin is a very good liar, and he has no problem lying to the public, to the world, to the Russian people. And that's why I think it was not smart for Trump to trust him, but it seems Trump has changed his mind. Because just today, while he was having his meeting with the Prime Minister of UK, he said, with Putin, you don't want to trust him, you always want to trust but verify.
Have I got that right? And why do you trust him?
Look, you know, it's trust and verify, let's call it that. And I think we both can be that way. You have to verify, because you never know what's going to happen. I know a lot of people that you would say no chance that they would ever deceive you, and they're the worst people in the world. I know others that you would guarantee they would deceive you. And you know what? They're 100% honorable, so you never know what you're getting. No, I have confidence that if we make a deal, it's going to hold.
Now, last time when I said this in a video, that Putin is not to be trusted, he has signed multiple ceasefires, multiple agreements with Ukraine, and he has broken every single one of them. He has violated every single peace deal he has signed, and that's something we have to keep in mind when we go into these negotiations. That's why we are asking for Ukraine to have proper security guarantees so Russia knows that it cannot just rearm and come back. When I said that Putin lies often and everywhere, there were some people in the comments who were saying, that's not true. Putin doesn't lie. It was Ukrainians who lie. So today I have a compilation. Not just one clip, not some isolated clip. I have a list of clips that show from Putin's words himself, from his mouth, the words that come out of his mouth, saying that Ukraine is an independent state, saying that this conflict is not about territory, saying that Crimea is a Ukrainian province, and then Putin just a few years later going back on his words. Now, I don't know about you guys, I consider that lying. So let's look at these words and then you guys tell me, all of you guys who are commenting that Putin doesn't lie. Here's the first clip. You saw a little bit of this at the beginning, but here's the entire clip. Putin saying that Crimea belongs to Ukraine.
Crimea is not a disputed territory. Russia has long recognized the borders of today's Ukraine. I believe that raising such issues regarding Russia has a provocative undertone. The problem of Crimean Tatars, the Ukrainian population, the Russian population, and the Slavic population in general is an internal political issue of Ukraine itself. Is it even hypothetically possible that you would also defend the interests of Russian-speaking residents of Crimea? Could there ever be a situation in which Russian troops would enter Ukraine or not? We will continue to fight for equal rights, but that does not mean we are going to brandish swords and send in troops. That's complete nonsense. Nothing of the sort is happening or will happen. The blocking of Ukrainian military units in Crimea was carried out by forces wearing uniforms very similar to Russian military uniforms. Were they Russian soldiers? Look at the post-Soviet space. There are plenty of uniforms that resemble military uniforms. Go to a store here and buy any uniform you like. Were they Russian soldiers or not? They were local self-defense forces. That is a fact. We have never hidden it. Let's be clear. Our armed forces did indeed block the Ukrainian armed forces stationed in Crimea.
Now, I know the excuse these Putin bots are gonna use after watching that clip. And they're gonna say it was the Crimean people who voted to join Russia, right? Well, I wouldn't consider that a free and fair election when only two options the Crimean referendum had was join Russia or be independent. What about the option of staying with Ukraine? After all, Crimea was part of Ukraine all this time before Russian green men just showed up. And more importantly, how can we expect anyone to vote independently and free of fear when these people who had guns, these Russian soldiers, were all around Crimea and telling everyone to vote a certain way? See, that's exactly what happened back in 2014. It was not a free referendum, and people with guns, Russian supporters, Russian soldiers with guns, were all around the election booth. So even whatever results we had, it was not a fair result. And on top of that, people did not have all the options that they should have had. But this wasn't the only time Putin has lied. Let's watch the second clip.
The Ukrainian crisis is not a territorial conflict. I want to emphasize that. Russia is the biggest, the largest country by territory in the world. We have no interest in seizing any additional territories. We still have to develop and settle Siberia, Eastern Siberia, and the Far East. This is not a territorial conflict. As for the results of a prolonged process, well, of course, it can be a lengthy process. But then you mentioned that new territories have appeared, and that is still quite a significant result for Russia.
Oh, so Putin says this was not a territorial conflict, and then Putin says few years later, in fact, few months later this time around, that all the new territories Russia has controlled, Russia has captured, are part of Russia, and now Trump is saying he wants to free Mariupol, and the Russian officials are freaking out. They're losing their mind, making statements like, we're not going to negotiate if that's the line the US negotiators are going to take. We're not going to negotiate. The territories are not even on the negotiating table. At the end of the day, it's pretty clear why Putin wants those Ukrainian territories. The minerals under the ground, that's what Putin wants. Russia provides no value to the world except for the value they extract that's under the ground in Russia. The oil is the only thing that the country produces, and that's exactly what they want to do here in Ukraine. They don't know how to innovate. They don't know how to invent things. They don't know how to build businesses that can dominate the world, because that takes hard work. What they do know is just throw their soldiers as cannon fodder so they can capture more land, so they can take over more territory and extract the value that's underneath. Now let's hear Putin talk about the Wagner Group that tried overthrowing his own regime. Initially, Putin says there are no private militaries in Russia. It's illegal. And then Putin says it's the state that's funding Wagner. Make it make sense. Let's watch the clip.
I have already spoken about Wagner. I said that the Russian state has nothing to do with this. I speak with complete responsibility, without any hidden motives.
A few moments later.
The maintenance of the entire Wagner Group was fully provided by the state. From the Ministry of Defense, from the state budget, we fully financed this group.
Now let's get into our segment of Ukraine bringing this war inside Russia and showing the Russian people what Putin is causing. All the pain that Russian people are going through, all the economic hardship they are going through, all the funerals they're holding for their loved one who died in this special military operation, it's all Putin's fault. Let's watch that segment. Turkey has dropped the hammer on Russia. As US is pulling its support of Ukraine, Turkey is stepping in, and it's stepping in the worst way possible for Putin. Turkish President Erdogan just came out publicly and said that Ukraine deserves and needs a NATO membership. On top of that, he went as far as to say that Turkey supports Ukraine's full territorial integrity, and all the territory captured by Russia needs to be returned to Ukraine for there to be any lasting peace. Erdogan made sure to specify that this demand includes Crimea, and we'll get into later why Crimea is so important to Turkey. It's important to note that these aren't just words. Turkey has been supporting Ukraine militarily all this time, selling them drones and other military equipments, and on top of that, Turkey has the second largest military in NATO. So this is exactly why, while Russia was in Saudi negotiating a peace settlement in Ukraine with US, President Zelensky was in Turkey with President Erdogan, making sure that Ukraine can continue fighting for its independence, even if the US support falls out. Here's more details. Watch it yourself.
Thank you so much.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky used a visit to Turkey on Tuesday to emphasize the importance of Ukraine's allies deploying soldiers to guarantee any peace agreement reached with Russia.
Two issues are very important: a strong Ukrainian army and the deployment in Ukraine from other armies like Europe and the United States, our partners.
Zelensky said he had discussed the issue with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, but that it was too early to reveal the outcome of the talks.
Turkey and European countries have the same geostrategic interest. If you ask to Turkey and Turkish policymakers, for them, the main threat to security and stability of the country and integrity of the country remain Russia.
European leaders met this week to discuss the security threat facing the continent. With the Turkish army dwarfing most of its European counterparts, Ankara says it can play a key role in Europe's defense.
European allies can be understood that without Turkey, we cannot continue the defense of the European continent and Euro-Atlantic security. And is Turkey is ready to support this European security and defense capability? Yes.
Now, a quick reminder to hit the subscribe button down below if you want to continue keeping up with the geopolitical news. And now let's talk about why Turkey does not trust Russia. Well, the answer starts in history, because everything starts in history. Turkey and Russia have been at war constantly for the last few hundred years. The relations kinda improved when Lenin took power in Russia and helped the Turkish rebels fight for their independence against the Ottoman Empire. But all that progress was quickly destroyed when Stalin came into the picture and he started fighting with Turkey over territorial issues, saying, hey, we own this, everything that was part of Turkish Empire. Because of that, Turkey joined NATO against the Warsaw Pact. Now, things and relations did improve after Stalin died, and once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, relations between Turkey and Russia have been improving, but I wouldn't go as far as to say they're allies or friends. Turkey sees Russia as someone it has to fight with to manage regional influence. Perfect example of this we just saw in Syria, where Turkish-backed rebels just recently kicked out the Russian puppet Assad. But Russia sees Turkey as someone they have to keep happy, because if they need access to the Black Sea and continue trading with the rest of the world through seaports, they need to keep Turkey happy because they control the one strait from the Black Sea that connects the Russian ships to the rest of the ocean. Now, this shows that they both kinda need each other, but they also want to make sure to keep each other in check. That means for Turkey, pushing back Russia in Ukraine is not an isolated instance. In fact, Turkey has been challenging Russia over multiple fronts, from Libya to Syria to the Caucasus, and now even in Africa. Turkey wants to make sure that Russia does not expand its influence around Turkish borders. Talking about Syria, Turkey just recently exposed how weak the Russian protection or Russian influence is if someone is strong enough and has the political will to challenge it. Turkey-backed rebels were able to overthrow the Assad regime within days after Russia was supposed to be protecting them since 2015. Now, Turkey wants to do the same thing in Ukraine. That's exactly why Turkey has been involved in negotiations in this war ever since the beginning. The 2 rounds of negotiations that were held in 2022 did happen in Turkey. And then this is what Erdogan said just last year.
There is no doubt that Ukraine deserves NATO membership. I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate what I have always advocated. There are no losers in a just peace. Despite the differences of understanding between the two sides, it is our sincere desire that both sides go back to peace talks.
As you guys can see from the map on your screen, Turkey has been fighting Russian influence all around the Middle East and Africa, and even in Crimea. Turkey has been the long supporter, in fact, a very vocal supporter of Crimea being returned to Ukraine. This is in part because many ethnic Turks live in Crimea, and Crimea and Turkey have been historical allies.
The pain from the tragedy experienced by our Crimean Tatar Turk descendants who were forcibly removed from their homeland has not subsided for 80 years. The annexation of Crimea, which Turkey opposes and did not recognize from day one, has deepened their suffering. Our support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence remains unchanged. The return of Crimea to Ukraine is a requirement of international law. Ensuring the security and well-being of our Crimean Tatar descendants, the indigenous peoples of Crimea, is also among the priorities of our foreign policy. We expect all our Crimean Tatar descendants to regain their freedom as soon as possible.
Now, all the while Turkey is stepping up its support of Ukraine, it seems like the United States and the current administration seems to be falling more and more on the side of the Russians. We're giving them everything Russia has asked for. Today, Vice President Vance released a tweet explaining that all these specifics about the negotiations that are coming out are entirely false. Now, I don't want to show you guys the whole tweet, but I'll read this specific argument. And it goes, "On the specifics of the negotiation, I'm not confirming details publicly for obvious reasons, but much of what I have seen leaked ranges from entirely bogus to missing critical information. The president has set goals for negotiations, and I'm biased, but I think he's awfully good at this. But we are not going to telegraph our negotiating posture to make people feel better. The president is trying to achieve lasting peace, not massage the egos or anxiety of people waving Ukrainian flag. Now, this is an entirely fair and just argument, right? He should not be broadcasting his positions on peace negotiations publicly. And all these people talking about the leaks, that's wrong. But people are not really talking about the leaks here. In fact, it's not anonymous people leaking US positions in the negotiations. It's the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, himself saying that we're gonna give up NATO membership for Ukraine. We're gonna make sure Ukraine knows that they cannot get back to 2014 border. These aren't leaks coming from some random guy on the internet. These are Secretary of Defense saying this publicly, and that's basically all the arguments Russia wants. That's basically all the points that Russia wants, and we're just giving it to them before we even go into the negotiating room. Watch this clip yourself. I'm sure you guys have seen it, but watch it again.
We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. As part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
So even though Vance is publicly arguing that the administration does not want to negotiate in public, that's exactly what they are doing. Defense Secretary himself is basically shoving demands down Ukrainians' throat while not asking Russians a single thing that they have to give up to compromise for peace. Now, why are we doing it? Because as Trump said, Russian President Putin told him he wants peace. Of course, who wouldn't want peace? Anyone who wants to take over a country would much rather prefer to take over another country peacefully. He would much rather prefer that Ukrainians just lay down their arms and Russians can walk all the way up to Kyiv and install a puppet government. I think it's a good time to remind the current administration of what former President Ronald Reagan said about fighting for peace. Of course, when it's a choice between peace and war, everyone wants peace. But there is no peace if that peace is achieved through surrender. Hear it yourself.
As saying to 1 billion human beings now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain, give up your dreams of freedom, because to save our own skins, we're willing to make a deal with your slave masters. Alexander Hamilton said, a nation which can prefer disgrace to danger is prepared for a master and deserves one. Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war, but there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender. Admittedly, there's a risk in any course we follow other than this, but every lesson of history tells us that the greater risk lies in appeasement. And this is the specter our well-meaning liberal friends refuse to face, that their policy of accommodation is appeasement. And it gives no choice between peace and war, only between fight or surrender. If we continue to accommodate, continue to back and retreat, eventually we have to face the final demand, the ultimatum. And what then? Well, Nikita Khrushchev has told his people he knows what our answer will be. He has told them that we're retreating under the pressure of the Cold War, and someday, when the time comes to deliver the final ultimatum, our surrender will be voluntary, because by that time, we will have been weakened from within spiritually, morally, and economically. He believes this because from our side he's heard voices pleading for peace at any price, or better read than dead, or as one commentator put it, he'd rather live on his knees than die on his feet. And therein lies the road to war, because those voices don't speak for the rest of us. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the Pharaohs? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire the shot heard round the world? The martyrs of history were not fools. And our honored dead, who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis, didn't die in vain. Where then is the road to peace? Well, it's a simple answer after all. You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance.
What makes this situation so much confusing for me is this isn't even the American opinion. Only 9% of Americans support or even like Putin. So if foreign policy is born out of domestic policies, Americans don't really want a dictator like Putin becoming more powerful, gaining more territory, and on top of that, gaining trillions and trillions of dollars of minerals that are under the territory that he controls, the Ukrainian territory. And this is exactly why you see media from both sides of the political aisle here in the United States, from the right and the left, saying exactly what Trump is doing is incorrect. It's wrong. It doesn't make sense. How can we be so supportive of Putin when he was the aggressor in this war, when Russia was the one who invaded a sovereign country? Listen to it yourself.
He says that Zelensky has a 4% approval rating. The numbers that we have seen are more in the 50% range, north of 50% range. And he's criticizing Zelensky for not holding elections. Now, clearly, this is something that Russia would like to see happen because they would love to get a Yanukovych or somebody who, is much more favorable to Russia into that seat. Is the president undermining the election process? And can an election take place in the middle of this war at all, General?
Well, a couple of things. Yeah, Zelensky's polling as of February this month is 57% favorable. It was 52 in December. I mean, it was in the 90s in 22 when the war started. But obviously, he got very favorable ratings. Look at the Constitution that Ukraine has prohibits elections when you declare martial law because of a state of war takes place. And obviously, the incumbent who is trying to run a war to be involved in an election and bringing people together in primaries and other elections puts the people at risk. There's two other parts of that martial law. If you're 18 to 60 years of age and a male, you can't leave the country. And also they're curbing civil liberties, particularly freedom of movement, by curfews in the contested areas. So the fact that their constitution is driving this, the parliament, bipartisan support for all the extensions they've had to the martial law. So they are acting democratically, in my judgment, in abiding by their constitution. And also the parliament is supporting it, which represents the people throughout the country. These are democratic actions taking place in a democratic country. I don't believe we should try and push elections on Zelensky during the middle of this war. I think if there is a peace agreement, I think Zelensky and others and the people themselves will demand an election, and it would likely take place assuming the peace agreement has some real legs to it.
While this is all happening, Russian media, the Kremlin TV, is publicly celebrating their ability to control what Trump thinks, their ability to get Trump to believe whatever they want. Hear it yourself, Russian media publicly admitting that some of the stuff Trump has said about Zelensky, like the 4% approval rating, Zelensky being a dictator, that all came straight from Putin during their phone call. Let's play the clip.
It's no coincidence that Elon Musk described our delegation as clearly serious negotiators. On one side, there's the classic Russian-Soviet diplomacy, often accused of being slow and cumbersome. That's the reason things don't always go the way you expect. The second approach is hysterical, overly theatrical, built on constant accusations, pure PR with no real meaning or substance, represented by Zelensky and his team. Now we see Mr. Witklow, or however his name is pronounced. He spent 3.5 hours talking with Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin before the phone call between our leaders. Then there was a 1.5-hour conversation. And what do we see? We see that when Trump answers questions at a press conference, it's no accident. Many of the narratives he presents are the same ones we've been promoting. These narratives emerge after that conversation. It shows an understanding of our position, a grasp of the historical context over the past 3 years, and a sense of the diplomatic track and potential agreements. Look how directly it all sounds, right? It could have all been settled with far fewer territorial losses. But that's not what this is about. When Ukraine screams that it's impossible to negotiate, well, why is that? Trump calmly explains things. Even defending us, Trump, with his statements, especially one in particular, made many things clear if you paid attention to it.
Turkey might just be on its way to becoming the next superpower, and leading the charge is none other than Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Whether you love him or hate him, you've got to admit he's been playing one hell of a game when it comes to his country's geopolitical interests. Just last week, Erdogan showed up at the European Political Community Summit in Budapest and, once again, made it clear that Turkey is still very much committed to joining the European Union. The timing of this announcement couldn't be more crucial, especially given the current geopolitical climate. But here's where it gets really interesting. Right now, Erdogan is still playing both sides. He's keeping Russia a bit close while still staying constantly in touch with NATO and the EU. But if this actually goes through, if Turkey does manage to join the EU, then the balancing act would be over. Turkey would become a fully committed Western ally, leaving Putin standing there looking like a fool who bet on the wrong horse with one less quote-unquote neutral partner to rely on. When Russia decided to invade Ukraine in 2022, most countries were quick to distance themselves from Moscow. Sanctions were slapped, diplomatic ties were cut, and everyone was scrambling to reduce their dependence on Russian energy. But Turkey took a completely different approach. Instead of backing off, Turkey went all in on buying Russian oil and gas. In fact, Turkey's energy imports from Russia almost doubled between 2021 and 2022, jumping to a whopping $41 billion. You might be wondering, why did Erdogan go this route? Well, at that point in time, Turkey was in the middle of a severe economic crisis. Inflation was through the roof, the Turkish lira was plummeting, and ordinary citizens were struggling with rising prices. So the country needed a stable energy supply to keep its economy afloat, and Russia was more than willing to provide it. Now, maybe from Putin's perspective, this was him throwing a bone to Erdogan, offering a lifeline in the hopes of securing Erdogan's loyalty. But in reality, he couldn't have been more wrong, because Erdogan was playing a much bigger game. From Erdogan's perspective, securing cheap Russian energy was a way to buy time. It allowed him to stabilize the economy, keep factories running, and avoid the kind of energy crunch that was sending Europe into a panic. But at the time, Erdogan knew he had the bigger hand, so he waited for the perfect moment to strike. And sure enough, just a few months back, Erdogan made a pretty bold statement by openly declaring that Crimea should be returned to Ukraine, citing international law as his backing. Now, that's not exactly what you'd expect from a leader who's supposed to be cozying up to Putin, is it? But why now? And why is Turkey joining the EU such a big deal, especially since it's already a NATO member? Shouldn't that mean that it doesn't really change much? Well, that's where you're mistaken. So let's start with the basics. First, the European Union and NATO are two very different clubs, so each has its own set of rules and priorities. NATO, at its core, is a military alliance. Its primary focus is defense and security. The whole idea behind NATO is that if one member is attacked, the others are obligated to come to its defense. It's a collective security pact designed to deter potential aggressors because they know they'd be up against not just one country, but an entire alliance. But beyond that, NATO doesn't concern itself much with how its members run their economies, enforce laws, or govern their citizens. It's mainly about ensuring military readiness and strategic unity. The European Union, on the other hand, is an entirely different beast. It's an economic and political union all about integration. Being a member of the EU means opening up your borders, aligning your laws, and committing to shared values like democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Joining the EU is also about transforming your entire economy to fit into a single market of over 450 million people. For Turkey, this would be a monumental shift. The country is already the second largest military in NATO after the United States. It is also a significant player in areas like trade, agriculture, and energy transit. If Turkey were to join the EU, it would gain access to one of the largest and most prosperous markets in the world. This could be a massive boost for Turkey's economy, which has been struggling in recent years. European businesses would get more access to Turkey's markets, while Turkish companies would benefit from the EU's trade networks. So clearly, joining the EU would be a massive shift for Turkey, but it also means that Turkey would need to align its laws and policies with EU standards, which is one of the main reasons it's taken decades for the country to even get close to membership. In a bit, we'll explore why Turkey's journey to join the EU has stretched on for decades. But before that, let's focus on the scenario of how Turkey joining the European Union could turn into a major setback for Vladimir Putin and his military ambitions, particularly in the Black Sea. As of this moment, Turkey holds control over two of the world's most strategically critical maritime choke points, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles Straits. Together, these narrow waterways are collectively referred to as the Turkish Straits. These straits form the sole maritime link between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. For Russia, this connection is nothing short of a lifeline, especially for its Black Sea fleet. Without access through these straits, the fleet is essentially trapped. unable to project power or support operations beyond the Black Sea region. That gives Turkey a unique and potent leverage, especially when dealing with Moscow. Under the 1936 Montreux Convention, Turkey has the legal authority to regulate naval transit through these straits, especially during wartime. This means Turkey has the legal framework to shut the door on Russian warships trying to enter or exit the Black Sea, effectively isolating Russia's naval capabilities in the region. Initially, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Turkey was hesitant to invoke Montreux Convention's wartime clauses. Despite issuing public statements condemning Russia's aggression, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan remained cautious about taking concrete actions. Some analysts even suggested that Erdogan's reluctance to act decisively was his way of throwing Putin a bone, preserving their fragile partnership amid growing international tensions. But then this hesitation had significant consequences for Ukraine because the open Turkish straits allowed Russia to reinforce its Black Sea fleet. During the first few days, at least 6 Russian warships and a submarine passed through these waters, moving from other naval bases to bolster their presence in the Black Sea. At the same time, Turkey's actions didn't go unnoticed. Policymakers in Washington and Brussels raised concerns about Turkey's inaction, particularly given its status as a NATO member. Now, Erdogan had to please the West, so just 6 days after Russia's invasion, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu announced that Turkey would close the straits to all military ships, invoking the wartime provisions of the Montreux Convention. For Putin, the closure of the Turkish straits was yet another embarrassment. Turkey's sudden shift also had broader geopolitical implications. It reassured NATO allies that Turkey was willing to align itself more closely with the alliance's objectives, despite its earlier hesitation. But Russia, being Russia, found a loophole in the Montreux Convention to exploit. The agreement includes an exemption that allows warships to pass through the straits if they're returning to their registered home ports. This meant Turkey couldn't fully block Russian naval access to the Black Sea, as Russia could simply claim its vessels were merely returning to their home ports. However, the rule also stated that these ships couldn't participate in any ongoing conflict. And yet, as we all know, Vladimir Putin played by his own rules and ignored that restriction entirely. Conveniently, Russia also had nearly half of its combined Mediterranean Black Sea fleet, over 4 dozen ships, stationed just outside the straits. By claiming these vessels were returning to their bases, Russia legally bypassed Turkey's restrictions and reinforced its Black Sea fleet. Now imagine if Turkey were a member of the EU. Turkey wouldn't just be acting independently in managing the straits. Its decision would align more closely with EU policies. Realistically, the EU could push Turkey to adopt stricter interpretations of the Montreux Convention or find ways to limit the quote-unquote return-to-base loophole. This would effectively trap its Black Sea fleet in the Black Sea and block Russia's ability to project power into key regions like the Middle East or North Africa. For example, during the Syrian civil war, Russia relied heavily on its Mediterranean fleet to support operations. Without access to the Mediterranean, such actions would become nearly impossible. Beyond military implications, Russia has 2 critical warm water ports in the Black Sea, the port of Novorossiysk and the port of Sevastopol. These ports are vital for exporting oil, grain, and other commodities to global markets. However, for these exports to reach destinations beyond the Black Sea, they must pass through Turkish-controlled waters. For now, the straits remain open for commercial shipping, even during conflicts, ensuring the flow of trade and avoiding undue disruptions. According to data from Nordic Monitor, 39,000 vessels transited the Istanbul Strait in 2023, up from 35,146 in 2022, although these numbers are still part of a broader decline. To put this in perspective, traffic through the strait peaked in 2007 with 56,606 vessels, but has been gradually decreasing, partly due to shifting trade routes and more recently due to the impact of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. Generally, cargo ships make up the largest category, followed by bulk grain carriers, essential for global food supply chains. Oil and liquefied gas tankers rank third. This shows how important this route is for energy exports. But this could also be a factor where the EU could strike. Before digging deeper, just a reminder to hit the like button below. It helps us tremendously in the YouTube algorithm when making geopolitical videos that YouTube is often restricting. For instance, imagine a scenario where every Russian cargo ship passing through the Bosporus is subjected to enhanced scrutiny, backed by EU regulations. These inspections could slow down trade, increase costs for Russian exports, and disrupt supply chains. In a worst-case scenario, the EU could even push for a blockade of Russian vessels, citing security concerns or violations of international norms. Such measures would severely impact Russia's ability to move its commodities to global markets, creating economic bottlenecks that would ripple across its economy. Similarly, delays in grain exports could damage Russia's reputation as a reliable supplier, leading buyers to seek alternatives and further isolating Moscow's economy. Not only that, but Turkey would also be obligated to adhere to the sanctions and economic policies implemented by the EU. This would be a setback not only for Putin, but also for Erdogan, because Turkey's purchase of Russian crude oil has dramatically increased since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In the first half of 2024, Turkey went from being the 14th largest buyer of Russian crude oil to becoming the 3rd largest importer. Refined oil products imported from facilities like Turkey's Star Refinery, Tupras Izmit Refinery, and Tupras Aliaga Izmir Refinery alone have generated an estimated $750 million in tax revenue for the Kremlin. These funds indirectly support Russia's war effort. However, as an EU member, Turkey would lose the ability to make these independent economic decisions. Membership in the EU comes with an obligation to align with its collective economic policies, including sanctions on Russia. But as I said earlier, it won't stop at energy. EU membership would also mean that cargo ships passing through the Turkish Straits would face much stricter inspections. The EU would likely impose heavy inspections on Russian cargo under the pretext of enforcing sanctions. This could include scrutinizing cargo items that breach sanctions or are dual-use goods with potential military applications. Such inspections would again create significant delays, increasing shipping costs and disrupt trade flows for Russia. Joining the EU would also require Turkey to sever all defense trade with Russia as a part of aligning itself with EU policies. At first glance, this might not sound like a big deal because, as of now, the numbers aren't staggering, but the real impact lies in the long-term consequences and how this shift would shape Turkey's future policies and alliances for decades to come. A prime example of this would be the purchase of the S-400 missile system. Back in 2017, Turkey struck a $2.5 billion deal with Russia for this advanced air defense system. This sent shockwaves through Turkey's relationship with its NATO allies, particularly the United States. It showed that Turkey was willing to pursue an independent defense policy, even if it meant clashing with the West. But that independence came with a cost. Before all of this, Turkey had actually approached the United States to buy the Patriot missile defense system, but the US declined the offer. Washington wasn't comfortable giving Turkey access to such a sensitive system, especially since Turkey also wanted the ability to produce or modify the Patriots locally. To make things worse, the US decided to pull out the few Patriot systems it had stationed in southern Turkey, claiming they were no longer necessary. For Turkey, this felt like a major blow to its defense capabilities. At the time, the region was becoming increasingly unstable. There was the conflict in Syria, and the risk of missile attacks was growing. With few options left and a real need to boost its defenses, Turkey turned to Russia and struck a deal for the S-400 missile system. The S-400 is considered to be one of the most advanced air defense systems in the world. It can detect, track, and take out multiple targets simultaneously from up to 250 miles away. For Turkey, this system was a solid match for defending against threats like high-speed fighter jets, cruise missiles, and even stealth aircraft. It filled a critical gap at a time when Turkey felt increasingly isolated in its security needs. But there's a catch. The S-400 works best when it's integrated into the host country's military infrastructure. That's one of the reasons why it's so effective. But for NATO, this created a whole new set of problems. You see, NATO's defense systems are supposed to work as a unified network, sharing data, intelligence, and operational protocols seamlessly. NATO feared that integrating the S-400 into Turkey's system could give Russian technicians or engineers access to sensitive NATO information. The system could collect intelligence on NATO aircraft, like their flight patterns, radio signatures, and operational strategies, and that data could end up in Moscow's hands. So this was a genuine risk, and that's why the United States reacted so strongly to Turkey's decision to buy the S-400. Now, keep in mind that all of this was happening while Turkey was already a part of the F-35 stealth fighter jet program. Turkey was one of the original investors in the Joint Strike Fighter project, putting $175 million to help develop the aircraft. The plan was for Turkey to buy 100 F-35s, which would have made it a significant player in the program. Turkish companies were also heavily involved in producing critical components for the jets, from fuselage parts to wiring systems. If everything had gone as planned, these manufacturing contracts could have brought huge economic and technological benefits to Turkey's defense industries. That's thousands of jobs, advanced manufacturing expertise, and a stronger industrial base. But when Turkey decided to go with the S-400 deal, the United States didn't take it lightly. Washington warned that there would be serious consequences. Despite the backlash, President Erdogan doubled down, seeing the S-400 purchase as essential for addressing Turkey's security needs and asserting its independence in defense decisions. So, the US kicked Turkey out of the F-35 program entirely. Turkish pilots training on the jets in the F-35 were sent home, and the deal to buy 100 F-35s was scrapped. Not only did Turkey lose out on the F-35 jets, but its defense firms took a massive hit as well. These companies, which had been manufacturing key components for the F-35, lost billions of dollars in contracts. Then, just a year later, in December 2020, the United States imposed sanctions on Turkey under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CAATSA. These sanctions specifically targeted Turkey's Presidency of Defense Industries, SSB, the agency responsible for managing the country's defense procurement and development. The SSB was banned from obtaining export licenses for U.S. defense technology and weapons, effectively cutting Turkey off from critical American military hardware and expertise. On top of that, 4 senior officials, including SSB's head, Ismail Demir, were blacklisted. This meant asset freezes and visa restrictions, further isolating Turkey's defense sector from crucial international partnerships. For a country aiming to expand and modernize its defense industry, this was a serious setback. Despite all this mess, Turkey stood firm in its decision to purchase the S-400. Instead of backing down, it went a step further by conducting tests of the system, escalating tensions with both the US and NATO. Now, this is what you have to understand. Instances like this have a noticeable impact on how the European Union views Turkey. While the S-400 wasn't the only reason the EU has been hesitant about Turkey's accession, it certainly added another layer of complexity to an already strained relationship. Even now, the S-400 issue remains a major point of contention between Turkey and its NATO allies, especially the United States. But after 5 years of tensions, it seems now like there could be a path toward resolution. Over the summer, reports emerged suggesting that the United States had submitted a detailed proposal to resolve the issue. The plan reportedly allows Turkey to retain the S-400 systems on its territory, but under strict conditions. The systems would be stored under US supervision at the Incirlik Air Base, effectively neutralizing their operational use while addressing NATO's security concerns. In return, the US reportedly offered to readmit Turkey into the F-35 program and lift the sanctions. If true, this proposal marked a significant shift in Washington's stance, signaling a willingness to compromise to bring Turkey closer to the West and away from Russia's influence. Such an arrangement could potentially heal some of the damage in the US-Turkey relations, while also strengthening Turkey's position within NATO and the European Union. But Turkey officially denied these reports, claiming that it had no intention of changing its stance on the S-400. Despite this denial, analysts believe there's still room for a deal, even if it doesn't look exactly like the one described in these reports. It wouldn't be surprising if a compromise emerges where the S-400 is effectively stored away or rendered inactive in a way that minimizes any risk to NATO systems, especially the F-35. Now, the timing of this is important to note. Back in 2019, when Turkey first acquired the S-400, the geopolitical landscape was very different. At that time, Turkey was trying to strike a balance between its relationships with the West and Russia, but that's not the case today. With the war in Ukraine, Turkey has adopted a much firmer stance against Vladimir Putin. It's been diplomatically supporting Ukraine and even supplying Bayraktar drones that have become a critical part of Ukraine's defense. So in a way, holding on to the S-400 no longer makes the same strategic sense it once did. Even if we set aside the S-400 issue, Turkey still has a long road ahead before the EU can seriously consider it as a potential member, and the challenges ahead go far beyond defense policies. They're rooted in the EU's foundational principles and history. To understand where all this comes from, you have to look back at Europe after World War II. The continent was devastated, and something drastic had to be done to prevent such a catastrophic war from ever happening again. That's when NATO was born, in 1949. It started as a survival pact for 12 countries. The idea was simple, and it still holds true today. If one member is attacked, it's considered an attack on all of them. NATO created a unified front to deter external threats, but that left another pressing issue: how to stop wars from breaking out within Europe itself. So just 2 years later, in 1951, 6 countries, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, formed the European Coal and Steel Community. The idea was that these nations shared resources essential for war, like coal and steel, and they'd have no reason to fight over them. The idea was as simple as that, and that's maybe why it worked. After all, if your industries and resources are intertwined with your neighbors, starting a conflict makes no sense. As I mentioned earlier, NATO is primarily a defense pact, focused on military collaboration and collective security. That's why in 1952, Turkey was brought into the fold. At the time, Turkey was eager to modernize and align itself with the West. The country had recently transitioned into a multi-party democracy after decades of one-party rule, and joining NATO was a way to signal that it belonged among the Western powers. But even back then, it was clear that Turkey was the odd one out. Geographically, most of Turkey is in Asia. Culturally, it leaned more towards the Middle East than Europe. But strategically, Turkey was a jackpot for NATO. Its location is like an ultimate gatekeeper, sitting right at the crossroads of Europe, the Middle East, and the Soviet Union. This gave NATO a crucial advantage. Turkey's position made it a natural barrier against Soviet expansion into the Middle East, and provided a critical foothold for monitoring and controlling this volatile region. Meanwhile, the European Coal and Steel Community was proving to be a huge success. By 1959, the same 6 countries decided to take their collaboration to the next level. They signed the Treaty of Rome, creating the European Economic Community, EEC, which laid the groundwork for what we now know as the European Union. The EEC wasn't just about coal and steel anymore. It was about fostering economic integration and creating a single market for goods, services, labor, and capital. Turkey saw this as a golden opportunity. Gaining access to European markets would be a game changer for its economy and international standing. So in 1959, Turkey applied for associate membership in the EEC. 4 years later, in 1963, the two sides signed the agreement for creating an association between the Republic of Turkey and the European Economic Community, better known as the Ankara Agreement. This agreement set out a 3-step process aimed at creating a customs union and eventually paving the way for Turkey's full membership into the European Economic Community. This first step was all about Turkey laying the groundwork for economic integration. The EEC recognized that Turkey's economy was significantly less developed than those of its European counterparts. So, during this phase, Turkey would receive financial and technical assistance to modernize its economy. The idea was to help Turkey build a stronger industrial and agricultural base, making it more competitive in the European markets. This phase also gave Turkey time to begin aligning its laws and policies with those of the EEC. The transition phase focused on creating a customs union between Turkey and the EEC. A customs union is a trade agreement where member countries agree to eliminate tariffs and trade barriers on goods exchanged between them, while also adopting a common external tariff for goods coming in from non-member countries. If all of this went well, then the final phase was to be a full member, but this still hasn't happened yet. During the 1970s, Turkey was facing severe political instability. Military coups, economic crises, and widespread social unrest became defining features of the era. These internal struggles made it difficult for Turkey to align itself with European standards outlined in the Ankara Agreement. For Europe, Turkey's instability raised serious doubts about its readiness to join the bloc, and those doubts stalled the process. Sure, the Ankara Agreement technically remained in effect, but there was literally no progress towards the membership. On one hand, Turkey was growing frustrated, whereas Europe was waiting to see whether Turkey could stabilize itself and catch up economically before any serious steps towards membership could be taken. The 1980s were no different in terms of challenges. After the military coup in 1980, democratic institutions were suspended, and a period of military rule followed. During this time, reports of human rights abuses emerged, including restrictions on free speech, political arrests, and the suppression of dissent. These issues drew widespread criticism from European governments and human rights organizations, further tarnishing Turkey's image in the eyes of the European community. But by 1983, there were signs of change. Turkey transitioned back to civilian rule, with a new government elected under a revised constitution. The new leadership, particularly under Prime Minister Turgut Özal, focused on economic reforms aimed at modernizing the country. Özal's policies emphasized liberalization, privatization, and opening Turkey to global markets. These changes started to deliver tangible results. Turkey's economy began to recover. Exports grew, and foreign investments increased. Turkey also took a bold step in 1987 and applied for full EU membership. For Ankara, this application symbolized its commitment to aligning more closely with Europe and proving it was serious about being part of the Western Bloc. However, the EU wasn't convinced. Like last time, the EU again cited Turkey's human rights record and questioned its commitment to the EU's democratic and social values. The EU ultimately rejected the application, a decision that came as a significant blow to Turkey. But Ankara was still determined, and for many years remained on the EU's radar. By 1995, Turkey finally signed the second step, aka a customs union agreement with the EU. This agreement seemed like a milestone in the Turkey-EU relations. Under the customs union, Turkey removed tariffs on industrial goods and aligned its trade policies with EU standards. Turkey's exports to Europe soared, and the deal helped establish a stronger economic relationship between the two. But at the time, this economic success couldn't hide the political challenges Turkey continued to face. The Kurdish conflict in southeastern Turkey was escalating. Reports of military crackdowns, displacement of Kurdish communities, and restrictions on Kurdish culture and political expression became a recurring source of tension. These issues directly conflicted with the EU's emphasis on minority rights and democratic governance, further complicating Turkey's EU aspirations. Then again, Turkish leaders like Necmettin Erbakan, who became the country's first Islamic prime minister in 1996, brought concerns about Turkey's commitment to its secular foundations. Erbakan's rhetoric and policies, which leaned toward promoting Islamic values in public life, raised alarms in Europe, where secularism was seen as a cornerstone of modern democratic governance. The EU couldn't turn a blind eye to Turkey's actions, and during the 1997 Luxembourg summit, it made that abundantly clear. The Union granted candidate status to 11 other countries, but Turkey was deliberately left out. For Turkey, this exclusion wasn't just a setback. It felt like a slap in the face, a bitter reminder of Europe's lingering hesitation about fully accepting it. But by 1999, things took a turn. At the Helsinki summit, Turkey was finally recognized as an official candidate for EU membership. Turkey's leaders began to see EU accession not just as a foreign policy goal, but as a framework for domestic reform. Over the next 5 years, Turkey embarked on a focused trajectory, laying the groundwork to meet EU's stringent membership criteria. By 2003, Recep Tayyip Erdogan's rise to power brought new energy to Turkey's EU aspirations. As Prime Minister, Erdogan recognized the widespread popularity of EU membership among Turkish citizens, so he used the prospect of membership as leverage to implement major domestic reforms. One of his key moves was pushing the military out of politics, abolishing the death penalty, and allowing Kurdish language broadcasts. Erdogan also introduced reformist policies to meet EU's Copenhagen criteria. By 2005, Turkey officially began formal accession negotiations with the EU. At first, this seemed like the long-awaited breakthrough Turkey had been striving for, but as the process unfolded, it quickly became clear that things weren't going to move as smoothly as Ankara might have hoped. The EU's negotiations delved into highly detailed criteria that Turkey hadn't fully anticipated, so it quickly became apparent that Turkey wouldn't be joining the EU anytime soon. In nearly 2 decades of talks, Turkey has managed to open negotiations on just 16 of the 35 required chapters. Each chapter represents a specific policy area where the candidate country must align with EU standards. To this day, only 1 chapter has been provisionally closed. One of the most significant issues that Turkey is still going through is the Cyprus dispute. Since 1974, the island of Cyprus has been divided between the Republic of Cyprus in the south, dominated by Greek Cypriots, and the Turkish-controlled north, which remains unrecognized internationally. In 2004, the Republic of Cyprus joined the EU, bringing the unresolved division into the heart of European politics. The EU demanded that Turkey open its ports and airports to Cypriot vessels as a part of its accession conditions, but Turkey flat out refused, insisting that any move on this front would only happen if there was meaningful progress on resolving the broader Cyprus issue. Another major issue that still lingers in Europe is Turkey's size and its predominantly Muslim population. This has sparked endless debates over whether Turkey truly fits within the EU. Some leaders like France's Nicolas Sarkozy and Germany's Angela Merkel openly expressed their opposition to full membership, proposing instead a quote-unquote privileged partnership. Following a similar pattern, Turkey-EU relations hit another rough patch in the 2010s. One major turning point was the 2013 Gezi Park protests. What started as a small group of environmental activists opposing a development plan in Istanbul quickly snowballed into nationwide protests, with people demanding greater freedom of expression, a free press, and judicial independence. The Turkish government's response was brutal, using violent force to crack down on protesters. But this approach didn't go unnoticed and drew sharp criticism from around the world, especially from the EU. 3 years later, in 2016, there was a glimmer of hope when Turkey and the EU signed a landmark migrant deal. Under this agreement, Turkey pledged to stop the flow of migrants from the Middle East into Europe through its borders. In return, the EU promised billions of euros in financial aid, nearly visa-free travel for Turkish citizens, and an acceleration of Turkey's EU accession talks. On paper, it looked like a win-win situation. Turkey delivered on its part and drastically reduced migrant crossings and eased the crisis that had overwhelmed EU member states. But the promised benefits for Turkey never fully materialized. Visa-free travel stalled, and the EU accession negotiations barely moved forward. For Turkey, it felt like yet another broken promise, deepening its resentment towards the EU. But Erdogan learned a valuable lesson from this. He had found the EU's weakness. By loosening control on migrant inflow, he could create a crisis for Europe anytime he wanted. This dynamic only fueled the deep mistrust between Turkey and the EU, with both sides wary of each other's intentions. Just a couple of months after signing the migrant deal, Turkey faced another major crisis in July, a coup attempt by part of its military aimed at overthrowing President Erdogan. The coup ultimately failed, but Erdogan was enraged, not just at the coup plotters, but also at the EU. Instead of offering immediate and strong support for him in Turkey's democracy, the EU's response was slow and lukewarm. To Erdogan, it felt like Europe had abandoned him in a moment when solidarity was desperately needed. So naturally, things only got worse from there. After the failed coup, the Turkish government launched a massive crackdown, firing or arresting thousands of civil servants, military personnel, journalists, and academics suspected of involvement. But this time, the EU immediately condemned these actions as undemocratic, which only deepened Erdogan's anger and widened the already growing rift between Turkey and the EU. By late 2016, Erdogan himself publicly suggested that Turkey might need to explore alternatives to the EU. One of these was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. While it was more symbolic than realistic, Erdogan's comments showed how disillusioned Turkey had become with its EU ambitions. Around the same time, Erdogan began forging closer ties with Vladimir Putin. After the coup attempt, Putin was one of the first world leaders to call Erdogan and offer his support, a gesture that Erdogan didn't forget. Since then, the two leaders started building a closer relationship. Erdogan viewed Putin as a partner who didn't lecture him about democracy or human rights, making their relationship more appealing. This growing friendship quickly expanded into deeper cooperation, especially in areas like defense and energy. For example, the purchase of S-400 in 2017. By now, you can probably see the complex love-hate dynamic Turkey has with both the West and Russia. And this is exactly why, even after 6 decades of trying, Turkey still hasn't been admitted into the European Union. Even now, there's no clear path forward. With the EU promising future membership to Ukraine, that's likely going to take priority for the next several years, leaving Turkey once again in limbo.
Lastly, as you guys know, over the last 2 weeks, few of our videos have been demonetized by YouTube for talking about sensitive topics and covering violent events. This is why recently we opened up memberships on the channel. This way you guys can directly support our content. Again, you don't have to do it, we'll continue making the videos, but if you enjoy the content and you're able to support us, you can do so by signing up for our membership. It costs less than a cup of coffee at Starbucks and it's greatly appreciated.
The government of Assad in Syria has fallen. In just 12 days, rebels have toppled the dictator family that ruled the country for 50 years. At the center of this was the HTS rebel group and its leader, Ahmad al-Shara, also known by his fighter name, Abdul Muhammad al-Jalani. He is currently strengthening his grip over the new transitional government in Syria. But the interesting part about this is how the rebels took over the Assad regime. The HTS didn't just appear out of nowhere. For years, it has been strengthening itself in the Idlib province, safeguarded by none other than Turkey. And Turkey was more involved in the recent rebel offensive than many people realize. The Syrian National Army played a crucial role in the rebel offensive, fighting alongside the HTS. And this militia was created by Turkey. It's their chief backer to this day, providing weapons, funding, and coordination. Turkey itself is heavily involved in the Syrian civil war, as it holds Syrian territory in the north, and it has even performed multiple military operations inside of Syria. It is very likely that Turkey's President Erdogan knew about the recent revolt plans of the HTS, and even gave his permission for it. The reason for this involvement is that Turkey is playing a geopolitical chess game, mainly with Iran and Russia, but also with the US and Israel. Just like any other power, Turkey wants influence in the region, and it's willing to fight for it. In this video, we'll take a look at how Turkey has outplayed all of its rivals, and why it currently has the upper hand in Syria. But before we dive into the video, please hit that like button below to show your support for the channel. Making these videos costs a lot of time and effort, and it's only possible if you help us out in the algorithm. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get into the video. Now, as you might have noticed, the Syrian civil war is really complex. There are not two sides fighting, but about a dozen or more. To understand how Turkey has gotten involved in this, we need to take a look back. The story really begins in the 2010s. During this time, Erdogan was already rising to power in Turkey, serving as the nation's prime minister. He toured the Middle East in 2010 and 2011, which was a sign of a changing foreign policy. Erdogan wanted to position Turkey as a leader in the Middle East, a radical shift from earlier foreign policy. Around the same time, there was turmoil in many Arab nations. There were political uprisings and mass demonstrations in countries like Libya, Egypt, Yemen, and Syria, which later became known as the Arab Spring. Among the reasons for this were economic hardship and political repression. These events coincided with Erdogan's tours, and that wasn't by accident. Turkey saw this as an opportunity to get new allies and promote itself as the democratic alternative in the Middle East. That's why the tour was also dubbed the Arab Spring Tour. But in Syria, a country with 565 miles, or about 909 kilometers, of a border with Turkey, things went downhill. The dictator Assad was very afraid of the protests and began to use very harsh methods of repression. When security forces tortured and killed protesters, the Syrian population became very upset and started organized resistances. This started the Syrian Civil War in 2011, a war that has raged on for over a decade. Turkey was one of the first countries to actively support the opposition to Assad, as we'll get into later. But first, we need to understand the internal situation in Syria. Syria is a very divided country with a ton of differences. The former ruling family was Alawite, which was a sect of the Shia branch of Islam. The Alawites are a minority with their own culture and generally live in the west of Syria. The vast majority of the country are Sunnis, however, which is the biggest branch of Islam shared by most countries in the Middle East. Then you have the Kurds in the north of Syria, who follow the same religion but are ethnically separate from the Arabs. There's also a significant number of Assyrians in Syria who are mostly Christians. On top of this, there are many more small minorities. Because of these differences, there's not really a single resistance group in the civil war. The number of militias involved is in the hundreds, although they have formed loose alliances. You have moderate groups like the Free Syrian Army. They have broad support across many ethnicities. There are also Islamist groups, including the HTS. They have a strict interpretation of Islam, which doesn't sit well with Shia Muslims, moderate Sunnis, and other groups. In the north, you have the Syrian Democratic Forces, including Kurdish separatists of the YPG. They want a separate Kurdish state, so their goal is very different from the other rebels. On top of all this, there are radical jihadist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates. They are even more extreme, as they don't only have strong religious views, but are also willing to use violence. Assad's front was more united, although he also had many militias fighting for him instead of his army. What makes this even more complicated is that foreign countries got involved, including Turkey. Initially, it wasn't that Turkey hates Assad. On the contrary, the two nations had relatively friendly relations before the war. In August of 2011, the government of Turkey even rejected a US demand for Assad to resign. But out of strategic reasons, the Turkish government wanted to appeal to the Sunni majority in Syria. It sees the unpopularity of his regime as an opportunity to get more influence. Also, the war crimes that Assad committed rapidly shifted public opinion in Turkey. So not long after the fighting broke out, Turkey hosted defectors from the Syrian army to train on its soil. These fighters later announced the start of the Free Syrian Army, one of the major opposition groups. Turkey went on to give them funding and supplies, including ammunition, arms, and tactical equipment. Turkey supported them with logistics coming from the northern border. The United States and the Gulf countries also joined their support of the Free Syrian Army, providing financial support and weapons. Turkey stayed the most consistent in its involvement, though, as the United States eventually withdrew many of its troops and the Gulf nations lost interest. But while Turkey was doing this, Iran and Russia chose to prop up the Assad regime. Putin and Khamenei have sympathy for their fellow dictator in Syria, and they have strategic ambitions in the region as well. Iran wanted to use Syria as a hub for its axis of resistance against Israel, and as an extension of its power in the Middle East. Putin has a special interest in the port of Tartus in Syria, where Russia has an important naval base since the Soviet times. It gives the Russian Navy crucial access to the Mediterranean, and it's one of the few Russian warm water ports that can't easily be blocked by NATO. Apart from giving weapons and a financial lifeline to Assad, Iran and Russia went even further. Iran set up Hezbollah bases in Syria, a group linked to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They began fighting side by side with the Assad regime. Russia helped the Assad regime by bombing opposition-held areas. This was often with no regard for civilian life, but it was as ruthless as it was effective. Russia was one of the main reasons why the Assad regime stood as long as it did, as it provided capabilities that Assad's army couldn't dream of. In 2017, Russia also decided to set up bases in Syria to start military operations there. We should also briefly mention the US involvement in the war. American operations in Syria are mostly part of the war on terrorism, as it targets terrorist organizations like ISIS. ISIS expended a lot in the war-torn nations of Syria and Iraq, and at its peak, the group held about a third of Syria and 40% of Iraq. That was until an international coalition began to fight them, and basically everyone teamed up to destroy the caliphate. The Trump administration delivered the final blow to ISIS, and in 2019, the group lost its last territory. By that point, the US military had mostly left, although it still has troops near the oil fields in the east of Syria. But the US also has a lot of indirect involvement, and it's backed rebels under the umbrella of the Syrian Democratic Forces. You think that they would be on the side of Turkey as a NATO ally, but that's not the case. This SDF group includes a lot of Kurdish groups, including the Kurdish YPG militia, and Washington has got a lot of heat for this. Turkey believes the YPG is linked to the Kurdish terrorist organization of the PKK. The PKK has been active inside Turkey since the 1980s, and they pose a constant terror threat. This is because of a feud over eastern Turkey, where some Kurds want to start an independent Kurdish state. The Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the Middle East without a country, as they are spread across modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. The fact that Turkey hates this US-backed rebel group has led to some awkward situations. Turkey has fought the YPG on multiple occasions. In these fights, Turkey tries not to hit the US forces that back the YPG, one of the rare occurrences where NATO allies indirectly fight each other. The first Turkish military operation inside Syria was Operation Euphrates Shield from 2016 to 2017. A year later, in 2018, it invaded again with Operation Olive Branch, then again with Operation Peace Spring in 2019, and Operation Spring Shield in 2020, which we'll cover later because it has to do with the HTS. From 2022, Turkey has been bombing Kurdish targets. Just a few months ago, it destroyed 47 of them in retaliation for a terrorist attack on a Turkish defense company. With all of these campaigns, Turkey has two big objectives. It wanted to prevent a Kurdish autonomous region, and it wanted a buffer zone along the Syrian-Turkish border to protect its own land. This had mixed results, as Turkey couldn't capture territory all across the border. But in negotiations with the Americans, and after 2019, the Russians, Turkey got some kind of a buffer zone. In the west, there was an interesting section in this Turkish buffer zone. Near the Idlib province, Turkey didn't have direct control. Instead, it's an area controlled by Turkey's allies. We'll dive more into the specific region because it's where the recent rebellion came from. In the first years of the war, Idlib was an active fighting ground for the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army. However, they struggled to take over the province from Assad and Hezbollah forces. In 2015, jihadist and Islamist forces took advantage of the situation and managed to capture the city of Idlib. A year later, though, a jihadist group and an Islamist group turned on each other and began to fight. In 2017, a third militia joined the fight, and the province fully descended into chaos. That year, a city in the Idlib province also saw one of the worst chemical attacks in the war, and an attack by the Assad regime. Later, in 2017, the Islamist group led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham took control over the Idlib city and most of the land along the Turkish border. He beat some tough competition, driving out other extremists. They renamed themselves from Jabhat al-Nusra to HTS, erasing their former al-Qaeda links. Afterwards, Turkey launched an incursion into the Idlib province, establishing a dozen observation outposts. Interestingly enough, they didn't really touch the HTS. The HTS was initially not supported by Turkey, though. In fact, Turkey supported rival militias that were actively fighting them. These rival militias included the Free Syrian Army, the National Front for Liberation, and the Ahrar al-Sham Islamist groups. But seeing their strong position in Idlib, Turkey started a pragmatic working relationship with the HTS. What really changed the situation was a 2019 offensive by Assad. His forces started a major offensive into this last rebel stronghold, trying to retake the region with Iranian and Russian support. This was an impending disaster for Erdogan. 1 million people were displaced in Idlib, and they could flee to Turkey, causing a humanitarian disaster. If the Syrian government took over the region, the next step would likely be to retake the Turkish-held buffer zones to the east of Idlib, as they would get access to a key highway. To prevent this, Turkey directly intervened in early 2020. The Turkish armed forces were already fighting Assad from their observation outposts, often fully encircled by the Syrian army. Several Turkish soldiers had died in the clashes, but Erdogan doubled down, sending even more soldiers and increasing the number of outposts to 35. On the 27th of February, Turkey started Operation Spring Shield, a direct incursion into the Idlib province. This was in response to a Syrian or Russian airstrike, killing 34 Turkish servicemen. In response, Turkey sent up 20,000 soldiers across the border and killed 165 of Assad's forces in a matter of days. Russia went on to start ceasefire talks because it didn't want a full-scale war between Turkey and Assad. In the 2020 Moscow Agreement, the countries agreed that Assad could keep some of his gains and that Turkish and Russian forces would secure a safe zone between the opposition forces and Assad. Basically, Turkey had saved the HTS from going under. And afterwards, Turkey chose to tolerate the group and calm down the situation in Idlib. This was because the HTS started a local government called the Syrian Salvation Government. Erdogan previously stated that he was willing to work with any government replacing Assad, apparently even if they have an Islamist background. Idlib was also one of the last rebel strongholds, and Turkey wanted to keep the seed of resistance alive. Now, before moving forward, I wanted to share with you that I'm tired of seeing ads everywhere I go. I mean, how many ads has YouTube shown on this video alone? That's why we've launched a newsletter a few years ago called Global Recaps. We have been sending daily news right to you with no ads. Yeah, that's right. We have sent 2,500 newsletters to date, but not one of them have contained an ad. So if you want global news with no ads and no censorship, then this is the solution for you. Sign up now by scanning the QR code on the screen or link in the description. Sign up today and become more knowledgeable about the world you live in. Over the following years, Turkey's relationship with the Idlib province improved. Despite calls to remove the HTS from countries like Russia, Turkey didn't. The situation on the ground improved a lot, as the local government provided things like healthcare and education. The local economy improved, and Turkey can take credit for this. The Turkish lira was adopted as legal tender, providing more stability than its Syrian counterpart. The border with Turkey was opened up for trade, providing a crucial lifeline for the province. In return, the HTS tolerated Turkish-backed groups in the Idlib province, who united under the Syrian National Army. The HTS group opened up communication channels with the Turkish military, preventing any escalation in the region. It's unclear whether the HTS got any funding from Turkey, but Turkey at least helped them indirectly. The group gets a lot of money from taxes and tariffs in Idlib, and this local economy is supported by the trade coming from Turkey. This relatively stable situation continued for about 4 years. People weren't paying attention to Syria at all because all of the other global developments that were happening during that period. But Turkey and the HTS were secretly planning something. Seeing Russia distracted by the war in Ukraine and Iran suffering major blows in Lebanon because of the war in Israel, Assad's network of allies was significantly weakened. Russia needed its soldiers, fighter jets, and bombers at home. Iran's Hezbollah group lost a lot of soldiers and firepower, and its positions in Syria were also repeatedly bombed by Israel. So, the HTS and the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army began to plan an uprising. They reportedly already wanted to start in October, but Erdogan dismissed it. When they asked again a month later, the Turkish government and military probably gave them the green light. So, the HTS, supported by Turkey's Syrian National Army, went on with their rapid offensive on November 27th. It turned out to be a well-planned blitzkrieg, as they quickly went from the Idlib province to Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and eventually the capital, Damascus. It was the type of special military operation that would make Putin jealous. Assad's forces were overwhelmed, probably due to a lack of foreign support. Russia helped with a few bombing rounds on the rebels, but it was already too late. Assad was forced to flee, taking the first opportunity to go to Moscow, where he was granted asylum. This created an interesting situation, and an opportunity to put an end to the 13-year-long war. The HTS and its allies now occupy most of Syria, including virtually all population centers. However, the big question is, who will run the new government? Right now, there's a transitional government to manage the country's affairs. Ministers of the Syrian Salvation Government from Idlib, including the leader of the HTS movement, Mohammed al-Jalani, are at the center of this, joined by leaders from other rebel groups. The plan is to hold an election several months from now, once all the dust has settled and the conflict has cooled down enough. There will likely be a new phase of fighting between the HTS and Turkey on one side and the SDF on the other side. The transitional government will try to reunify Syria and take the SDF-held territory in the northeast. However, it's still not clear how this will go. It's very likely that the Syrian National Army and the HTS will be victorious. Then they will likely have a say over the new constitution, and they will have a big chance of winning a popular vote, as they're massively popular among the Syrian public right now. Currently, the streets in Syria are filled with massive crowds celebrating the fall of Assad and their new leader, Mohammed al-Jalani. If he and his allies get into power, this will mean a whole lot for foreign policy. Turkey has won the geopolitical game here, because the new government will be friendly to them. It has played a key role in supporting the opposition and giving the HTS a safe haven from 2019 onwards. For other countries, this is nightmare fuel, though. Iran could probably forget about having anything to do with Syria for the foreseeable future. Their support for Assad through funding and weapons sales won't be forgotten by Syrians, not to mention the Hezbollah paramilitary that was active in the war. The HTS especially won't forget them, as they've directly fought Iran's proxies. Iran is already crippled, and it's starting to lose its proxy war with Israel and Lebanon. Just before the insurgency in Syria started, Hezbollah agreed to a ceasefire in Lebanon with terms favorable to Israel, which is a sign of weakness. With Syria gone, Hezbollah and Iran are fully in crisis mode. They used to get their weapons and supplies to Lebanon through Syria, but that won't work now. This means that the axis of resistance is shattered. Meanwhile, Shia Syrians are fleeing the country en masse to Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon. They're afraid of persecution, because they're linked to the Assad regime and its Shia-majority ally, Iran. Mohammed al-Jalani has promised not to attack any minority, but you never know with a former ISIS and al-Qaeda member. So it's clear that Iran and its supporters aren't happy. The other big ally of Assad isn't doing much better. Russia is scrambling to get its military assets and Russian soldiers out of Syria, which it deployed there in 2017. Russian ships have abandoned their port in Syria, and there are doubts whether Russia will be able to keep its strategic naval base there. Putin sure hasn't made himself popular with the Syrian people, as he helped Assad with the infamous bombing campaigns killing thousands of civilians. Maybe Russia could start on a new page with the new government as it's trying desperately, but it seems unlikely. Russia, too, has fought the HTS before, killing many of its members. Turkey is the real winner in all of this, as it stands to gain a lot of influence in post-Assad Syria. In return for helping the opposition, Turkey could replace other foreign nations and establish a military presence in Syria. This is a big deal, considering how strategic Syria's position is. It would catapult Turkey in the power rankings, and make Turkey one of the most powerful countries in the Middle East, likely surpassing Iran. Also, there are political advantages for Turkey as well. The new Syrian government will probably align itself with Turkey's interests. This includes the issues of the Kurds in Syria and Turkey. The new government in Syria could work together with Turkey to destroy the Kurdish YPG and PKK. For Erdogan, that would make him massively popular at home, as it's one of his biggest reasons why he got involved in Syria in the first place. The US will probably face a lot of pressure from Turkey and the new Syrian government to abandon the YPG and the SDF. With Trump getting into office, the US will probably get out of Syria, as he has already said before. It's not just about fighting and geopolitics, though. The refugee problem in Turkey is bigger than you think, and it's one of the biggest reasons why Turkey wants a new government in Syria. Right now, Turkey hosts 3.6 million Syrian refugees, and the situation has been going on for 13 years. For a country of 85 million people, that's a heavy burden, especially considering that Turkey isn't that rich. In Turkish politics, Erdogan has been getting a lot of heat for this, as some people in the opposition want him to deport these refugees. He partially listened to them in 2023, when he deported about 500,000 Syrian refugees to the Turkish safe zones and the rebel-held Idlib province. Erdogan was criticized for this by humanitarian organizations, but now that political issue seems to be resolved. The new government will welcome these refugees, and these millions of refugees will likely be returned. It's only uphill from there, because Turkey will probably help in the rebuilding of Syria too. Syria has lost more than $100 billion in infrastructure during the war, and the total economic cost is estimated to be $1.2 trillion. But Syria has a lot of economic potential. Before the war, it had a GDP of nearly $70 billion, which has gone down to just $9 billion right now. With Turkey's help, it can get back on its feet. As a neighboring country, Turkey is able to easily invest in the Syrian economy and trade with it. Also, Turkey will likely only profit from its reconstruction phase. Stocks of Turkish construction companies have been rallying since the fall of the Assad regime, and that's because they are about to get a ton of orders. And all of the money that's invested into Syria right now will pay off massively, as Syria's GDP has the potential to increase 10 or even 20-fold. All in all, the fall of Assad is pretty exciting stuff for Turkey. Because it helped the rebels, it will have a strong position in Syria for years to come, unlike its rivals, Russia or Iran. It could have been a move of geopolitical genius on Turkey's end, but they definitely had luck on their side. Thanks for watching. If you want to keep updated on our videos, please hit the subscribe button down below.
Ukraine is doing the unthinkable. It's striking inside Russia, and there's nothing Putin can do to stop it. That's because it's not a one big push to just destroy the Russian regime. Rather, it's droves and droves of smaller attacks that are just chipping away at the Russian economy and the Russian psyche. It's death by 1,000 cuts. Things have gotten so bad for the Russian economy that Putin is begging Kim Jong-un again. This time, not just for soldiers, but workers, so he can keep the Russian economy going. On top of this, Kremlin is adding more than 100,000 troops to its army because the casualties on the front line for Russia just keep on piling. So in today's video, let's go over exactly how Ukraine has continued to bring the war inside Russia, how Russia is coping with this, and why Putin is begging Kim Jong-un again. Let's start with recent attacks inside Russia because I know you guys love them. But first, give me a like down below on this video. It helps us out tremendously on YouTube. Let's check out this clip.
In November, the Ukrainian military confirmed 4 strikes into Russia, with these 2 both involving oil infrastructure. The following month, oil depots and production plants are hit again in 4 locations, including this one, the Ukrainians say is used to provide fuel for the Russian military. A 5th strike is against military infrastructure. By January, the strikes are even more intense, with 13 confirmed in total against oil targets, including 3 sites that are each hit twice. A 14th strike is against a microelectronics plant. Among the locations attacked twice is the Kristall oil depot, close to an airbase where Russia's strategic bombers are located. Satellite imagery shows the site before the attacks and after, where a fire is said to have burnt for 5 days. The Ryazan refinery is where another double strike took place. One of the 4 largest refineries in Russia, it was hit on the 24th of January and again the following day. As well as increasing in tempo, the drone strikes also show Ukraine's growing reach, such as these attacks on the 29th of January against an oil refinery and a pumping station that are 500 miles and 300 miles respectively from the Ukrainian border.
Now, this is only picked up in February, and we'll get to the February clips in just a second. But as we have covered before, the reason Ukraine is doing this is multifold. First of all, attacking refineries and oil depots that are supplying the front lines, that has a direct effect, a direct benefit to the Ukrainian troops on the front line. Because if the jets don't have fuel, they cannot fly. If the tanks don't have fuel, they cannot drive. If the donkeys don't have fuel, I guess that's why they brought the donkeys. But the other benefit is, of course, the economy. The Russian economy is dependent on oil, and if Ukraine can keep out one of the refineries that's producing even 1-2% of the total oil that Russia produces, that's a big hit, and that's what they've been taking advantage of. The good old double tap, where they hit a refinery, they wait a few days, if the fire is put out, they hit it again because Russians are not prepared for the same place to get hit twice. Now let's look at some of the February clips. This happened just a few days ago. First, we have the Saratov facility. It refines around 7 million tons of Russian oil a year. That's more than 2% of the Russian refinery capacity annually. And Ukraine just hit it, and here's the clip. Now, I already know someone's gonna comment down below saying, hey, refineries can be repaired. You know, it's not that big a deal. Of course, no one's saying these cannot be repaired. All I'm saying is it's very hard to repair a refinery that just keeps getting hit. The good old double tap. Here's another clip from the same refinery, just from a different angle. Now next up, we have another 2 key refineries, this time in Krasnodar region of Russia. But before we get to that, I do want to mention that some of the clips that I'm showing, they just have fire, so it's perfectly fine to show it on YouTube. But if clips have blood or anything more than that, I cannot show it on YouTube because YouTube has a habit of restricting our videos. And that's why we have Patreon. Over there, we post daily clips about everything that's going on in the war. And if that's something you guys are interested in watching, you can support us on Patreon for as little as $5 by clicking the link down below or scanning the QR code on your screen. You can follow along on the war, you can support the channel, and on top of that, we get experts to break down frontline clips, so it's very educational to hear that. And that's something we do want to post on YouTube, but it's just very hard to show frontline action on YouTube, so that's why we posted it on our Patreon. That's why if you're able to, you can support us on Patreon and you get a bunch of benefits. Now moving on to this refineries in Krasnodar region. These facilities produce around 6.5 million tons of oil annually. So it's still pretty big. It's not as big as the last one, but they still produce around 1.5% of Russia's annual oil supply. So here's the clip. Here in the next clip, you can see this from the highways, and that's another benefit of attacks like these that are really visible. They give the feeling to the Russian people that a war is going on their border, and even though Putin's media doesn't want to talk about the war, they see attacks like these and they're reminded that the war is not exactly going Russia's way. So let's watch this clip. Now, all the while this is happening, Russia is doing what it does best, and that's spreading propaganda and spreading fear in the Western societies, because Russia knows it cannot win on the battlefield, especially now where Ukraine is producing almost 1 million, I think 2.5 million, something like that, drones. There's no way Russia has the air defenses, Russia has the capacity to stop that. But one thing they can stop is just spread fear, and they can stop the support the Western countries that give to Ukraine if they can spread fear in the Western societies. And the newest way they're doing it, or I guess the trick that's as old as Putin himself, is Tucker Carlson. And what he's claiming is something we have talked about on this channel in, I think what I remember is 2023. I think RT, the Russian media, was spreading this lie that Mexican cartels are showing up with javelins that we sent to Ukraine. There was no proof, and this happened like a few years ago, and now we have Tucker Carlson bringing up the same point right when Russia is getting destroyed inside Russia by Ukrainian drones and Ukrainian agents. Let's watch this clip and then I'll give you a little bit more context.
Second fact, not guess, fact is Ukrainian military is selling a huge percentage, up to half of the arms that we send them. Half. And I'm not guessing about this, I know that for a fact, okay? Not speculation. And they're selling it, and a lot of us winding up with the drug cartels on our border. So this is a crime, what's happening. Our intel agencies are fully aware of this. You tell me they're not profiting from this. Of course, you think the CIA is not profiting from this? Yes, they are. I can't prove that, but I believe that. What they don't know this, I know this, but they don't know this. They know this. And no one is saying it. Like, no American seems aware of this. We're sending these arms to Ukraine, hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's being stolen and sold to our actual enemies. Like, what the? I'm trying not to swear. What is this?
Yeah, well, the reason why is because you have Zelensky, it was about 3 weeks ago, I think, was specifically asked this question. So he went at some length in one of his interviews to say, oh, no, absolutely not. There's no truth to that at all. We've implemented all this thing. I know that, but the media just reported what he said.
You know, the New York Times could get on the web and order Ukrainian weapons. That's a fact. I'm not guessing. It's a fact. They could do that today.
I guess he thinks if you say fact enough times, you don't have to provide any evidence. People will just believe that it's facts. But let me give you evidence of what I'm claiming. That this was a fake story that was planted by Russia Today, RT, the Russian propaganda news website, back in 2022, in fact. So even I was wrong. It's not 2023. It was in August 2022. And here's United 24 doing a deep dive on exactly how this story was made up. First, there was a fake ad on dark web or darknet, whatever the dark internet where people go to buy illegal stuff. And over there, the ad was that someone's selling Javelin for $30,000 USD. And then Russia Today is saying, oh, it's Ukrainian who are selling it. And then slowly it turned into, oh, Ukrainians are selling half the weapons that they're getting from America and Western countries. Now, this is where I watched Ryan McBeth's video, and he brought up a very good point. Since Russia Today is pushing this narrative for a long time that Ukraine is selling half the weapons that US is sending them, other countries are sending them. What does that tell us about the Russian military and the Russian army, who cannot take over Ukraine when Ukraine is selling half the weapons it's getting, and it's beating a much bigger army with half the weapons from overseas, and it's just showing Russia inside Russia with all the drones and everything? I guess that's just a funny way to think of it, which I didn't think Russian Today people thought about it before they started pushing this fake narrative. But another thing I do want to say, definitely go check out Ryan McBeth's video, because it's way better. He's a military guy, he's a programmer, and he has a way better explanation as to you can track everything we're sending to Ukraine. So no one can just say it's fact that they're selling everything, because you can track it's going to Ukraine and being used there. And definitely go check it out. I'll put it down below. This is where it's good that even though some of our dumb media personalities are falling for Russian propaganda, which is putting it nicely, at worst they're getting paid by Russia and to spread false information, but we do have good people in the government who are calling everything as it is. Here I have a video of Senator Roger Wicker, the senator from Mississippi, and he calls it exactly what it is. Putin is trying to rebuild the Soviet Union, and we need to be careful. We need to stop it before it gets out of hand, before we walk into a World War III. Let's watch the clip.
Vladimir Putin intends to return to as much of the old Soviet Union dictatorship as he possibly can. I hope this war ends. And frankly, I've hoped for 3 years under the Biden administration that administration would provide the freedom fighters inside their own country to have the necessary equipment, the necessary ammunition, the necessary permission to defeat this illegal invasion. But I simply, at this point, want to alert anyone who's listening, alert my colleagues, anyone who is listening to the sound of my voice in any way, to the reality of the utter cruelty, the unspeakable conditions that Russia uses in violation of every international law. If Vladimir Putin comes to the negotiating table and agrees to a ceasefire, we need to bear in mind that he is the gentleman who has countenanced this outrage that I've barely been able to speak about today. And any negotiations we have with the Russians and with the current leadership needs to be done in light of the facts as outlined in this independent report.
Now, the reason Russia is getting so desperate as to bring up something that was debunked years ago, and the reason they're raising 100,000 more soldiers to throw as cannon fodder into this war is because Ukrainians are actually shocking Russians with the way they are fighting, the way they're improving, and the way the process, the way the Ukrainian military just keeps getting more and more efficient. In fact, the things have gotten so bad that even Russian media is talking about this. It's talking about how good Ukrainian services, intelligence services, and Ukrainian defenses are. Think about that. In a country like Russia, where all the media is controlled by Putin, by Kremlin, the media itself is talking about how Ukrainians are good. They're surprisingly good. Listen to the clip yourself.
The war has been going on for 3 years, and actually, the Ukrainian intelligence agencies have demonstrated during 3 years a high level of professionalism, cruelty, and persistence. In general, enemies should be treated with respect. All the more so, I note that some of their areas of activities are causing considerable damage to our country.
Now, before I talk about this next part, I want to put a disclaimer that I'm not bringing this up as to say that Ukrainians are not good fighters or anything, but there's the other part to the story where Russians are just not fighting well. They have this bad strategy of not valuing their own soldiers. Just 2 days ago, I remember we showed a clip where how Russians sent a helicopter to rescue one of its pilot whose jet was taken down. The helicopter was attacked by a FPV, and then helicopter just took off. It's like, screw the soldiers, the pilot we were trying to protect. We would rather protect the helicopter. We would rather protect the equipment, not the person. That's how much they value their own people. And I'm guessing a helicopter guy, a pilot, jet pilot, is very high up in the hierarchy of people in the Russian army. Infantry, they have no regard for their lives, and they're just throwing them as cannon fodder, as you guys have been hearing all this time. But today, I have some stories from Russia that even shocked me. First one, we have a Russian tank and a tank driver attacking Russian soldiers and just running away. And this is not happening on the front line. That's the crazier part. This is happening on a Russian road, like a few miles away from the front lines. So this isn't like hectic, you're attacking and you accidentally like friendly fire. This is like pure negligence. Watch the clip yourself.
Just now at the checkpoint on the side bridge of Seladovsk, our tank ran over the guys and took off over there. Just now, literally ran over them. Guys, KIA. The tank just ran over them and took off. Effing disaster.
Now, before I show you guys this next clip, I know everyone loves to talk about corruption in Ukraine, and of course, it is a common thing. It was a corrupt country, and it's getting better, but it has ways to go. But the reason we learn about all these corruption stories from Ukraine is because Ukraine is enforcing the law. They're prosecuting corrupt people. They're prosecuting people who are stealing from taxpayers, who are stealing from the aid, and everything like that. Whenever people like Tucker Carlson or anyone who brings up Ukraine corruption as a reason that we shouldn't help Ukraine, they almost forget that Russia is a way more corrupt country than Ukraine. And here's a perfect example of that. Listen to this, because someone was supposed to hire this guy, send him to the front line. They're not doing their job properly.
Dear residents of the Perm region, I present to you a serviceman from the Perm region, conscripted as Skudimkar, who during his service, in just a year and a half, had 3 so-called injuries. First, he broke his arm while drunk. Second, on the line of combat contact, he looked where he shouldn't have and got a wound in the cheek. And the third time, he was sent to the training ground. There, on a drunken bench, he broke his leg. He received 9 million rubles from the government. He was even recommended for a government award. This wonder man, in quotes, somehow ended up back in the army. Well, in my opinion, the fault lies with the military commissar of the Perm region, some colonel. I'm aware of this. We talked with him about this topic. This person was diagnosed with mental disorders, had been in inpatient psychiatric treatment, yet was still conscripted. And now this serviceman only brings losses to our Russian army. I ask and appeal for this to be distributed throughout the Perm region, to all military commissariats, to show the disgrace of such servicemen.
Now, this next clip is dark, so just a warning for everyone before we move forward. We have Russian soldier admitting that Russians forced themselves, the Russian commanders forced their soldiers to finish off injured soldiers on their own side. So these Russian soldiers are finishing off or eliminating other Russian soldiers. I can't imagine what that does for the morale. I know Japanese had something like this in World War II, but that's a very different culture too. And on top of that, it wasn't helping the Japanese soldiers' morale. When you have to eliminate someone you just spent so long bonding, fighting with together, and now he's injured. And yeah, emotions definitely play a role here, and that's not good for morale when you have to do something like this. Watch the clip yourself. You can see the sadness in his eyes.
Karchuganov Konstantin Valerievich, call sign Korcha. I am serving in 254. Currently wounded, evacuation is not provided at all. They are driving us to the front lines. Commanders Ronin and Sirota force their own men to finish off the wounded. Throw grenades, execute them. I am not refusing to serve. I just want to save my life and return home. Help everyone who can. This is the situation.
Now, because of all this, how the things are going on the front lines and how things are going inside Russia and its economy, we just got the news that Russia didn't just want North Korean soldiers. Things are so bad, they wanted North Korean workers. They wanted people to come help out in the economy. And this is where we go back to something we have mentioned on the channel before. Russia loves bragging about the unemployment rate, and that's 2%, something like that in Russia. Putin mentioned that a bunch of time during his end of the year Q&A when what he did in December, but he doesn't look at it properly. Or I guess he's just lying to the Russian public. When you look at it from an objective point of view, you have to think about Putin just pulled out 1 million soldiers who are fighting on the front lines, maybe nearly 2 million, because almost 1 million soldiers are wounded, and another 1 million are fighting on the front lines for Russia. Those are the soldiers that are basically taken away from the workforce. And on top of that, when he launched this invasion, hundreds of thousands of Russians just left. And these aren't your average Russians. These are Russians with means, with money, and with intelligence. These are upper level in the economic production. You know, these were the people you wanted in your economy, and they just left because they didn't agree with the war, they didn't want to get drafted, whatever the reason. But since they left, they're out of the workforce, and that's why the Russian unemployment rate is so low. I guess there's 2 ways to decrease your unemployment rate. Either you provide everyone with jobs, or you just decrease the number of people in your population, and Russia did the latter. But it happened without Putin wanting it, so they're left with a lot of unfilled jobs, a lot of empty jobs that they need workers for, and that's why they're getting North Korean workers. North Korea sent thousands of workers to Russia in 2024, Yonhap reports. According to the South Korea's spy agency, DPRK is sending workers to work on construction sites amid massive shortages of workers in Russia. This is in direct violation of UN Security Council resolution, which forbid North Korea from sending its nationals overseas. The number of North Koreans entering Russia increased 12-fold last year. South Korean intelligence believe the workers are going to Russia on fake study visas. Pyongyang is happy to help prop up the Russian ailing economy and war efforts. We can only guess how much they're getting in return. I'm guessing a couple or tens of thousands, so maybe 10,000, 20,000. That's what 20,000 is what Kim Jong-un is getting for soldiers. Maybe for workers, it's a little less, but still enough for Kim to throw his people away. Now, it's not just the workers' problem that Putin is having. He is also having soldiers' problems. So what he's doing, he's raising another 100,000 people. Now, how is he raising that? We'll get to that in just a second. But first, let me show you this news that none other than President Zelensky broke himself.
Right now we know, our intelligence reports, that the Russians are creating new divisions and developing new military production. Obviously, their cooperation with North Korea will continue to expand. Unfortunately, modern warfare technologies, including drone technologies, are also being spread by Moscow in that region. And this means one simple thing. Putin is not preparing for negotiations or for peace, but for continuing the war. And not only against us, against Ukraine. They are now increasing their army by more than 100,000 soldiers. All partners must be aware of this and must see it clearly. We are ready to share important information, and relevant communication is already taking place through intelligence channels. We must jointly assess the threats and understand what tools we need to counter these actions. Here in Europe, every country will have to strengthen its defense, and the goal of allocating 5% of GDP to defense will not disappear from the agenda.
Now, lastly, I want to show you guys how they are raising these troops. They are just kidnapping their own citizens. Watch this final clip and you guys have a good day.